who are diagnosed with ADHD can pay attention to things that they are actually interested in. They just rebel against things that they're not interested in. And what our society, parents, children, media, accept the authority of these mental health professionals as being able to be the ones in our society to designate what personality types, what temperaments are mentally ill, disorders, and which temperaments are good, are healthy. And so I could tell you in 25 years of being in practice, no parent has ever dragged their kid into my office because the kid was too compliant. They were listening to teachers too well, or they were too conformist. Well, a society that would care about excessive compliance or fascism would care about something like that. But our society certainly doesn't care about that. Our society cares about making sure that we don't have kids creating tension, rebelling against the status quo. So that's what my profession does. It sort of functions as a sort of interpersonal police force in terms of designating certain temperaments, certain personalities as mentally ill or disordered. So again, we have the situation where you have as parents, society, kids, believing in some authority's view of what's mentally healthy, what's normal, and not their own gut. So those three major socializing forces for kids. What are the adults they see besides their parents? They see teachers, right? They see adults on television, and they see mental health professionals. These are the major socializing forces in their lives, and they're all teaching them to succumb to an authority's definition of education, of entertainment, of in fact of normality, of mental health. The DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, this is the Bible, the psychiatric Bible of mental diagnoses. And this first came into being in 1952, and the book was like this thick. And nowadays, we're in what we call the DSM-4. It's the fourth edition. Actually, there's been 5, and the book is like this big, and they're planning another one that's going to be coming out in a few years. Now, historically in the DSM, which is a publication of the American Psychiatric Association, that very few diagnoses are taken out. They are added. Lots of diagnoses are added. And so 1980 was a real interesting year because that was the year of real gigantic childhood expansion of diagnosis. So prior to 1980, which was the DSM-3, there was no such thing as oppositional defiant disorder, which is one of these diagnoses that I often talk about with people from the media, and they think I'm being sarcastic because they ask me, is that for juvenile delinquents? Is that for kids who are really getting into trouble with the law? And I said, no, that's a whole other diagnosis. That's conduct disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder kids are doing nothing illegal for the most part. They're just arguing with adults. They're refusing to comply with adults. They're angry with adults. They're resentful with adults. Those are the official symptoms. And that's what's added in 1980. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that was thrown in 1980. The interesting thing was 1980, there was one famous diagnosis that was taken out. And it actually had been taken out in the 1970s, it had been taken out. But it had been in the DSM-2. And it's very telling how it was put in and why it was taken out. Up until the DSM-3, homosexuality was a mental illness. In the early 1970s, there was gay rights activists who got very upset about being called mentally ill because they were gay. And so they became politically active. And one year there was actually the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, one that bright, they had their convention in San Francisco. And they got protested in major ways. And they got scared. They literally, these psychiatrists really got scared of these gay guys and these gay women. And there were gay psychiatrists who were in the closet afraid to say anything, but they were kind of rooting for them. And politically, through lots of political processes and demonstrations, homosexuality was kicked out as a mental illness in the 70s, and it wasn't in the DSM-3 in 1980. And the important thing for people to remember is that it was put in, obviously, for political, cultural reasons as a mental illness, and that homosexuality was taken out for political, cultural reasons. And in fact, every so-called disorder and illness in that DSM is in there for political, cultural reasons. Some of them are just more or less obvious. Homosexuality was one, oppositional defiant disorder outside of the American Psychiatric Association's pretty obvious to the American people that that's not an illness or even a disorder. That's just something you don't like. You'd rather kids be more compliant, so let's call them a mental illness. But I would tell you that almost all of these things, there's very few conditions in that DSM that are actually organic conditions that you can see with a lab test or an x-ray. And most of those are not really psychiatric conditions. They're neurological conditions. The vast majority of the things in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM are just behaviors that people have decided they don't like because they create havoc within a family, within a school, within a society. Nowadays, the most common so-called mental illness, mental disorder is depression. Depression, 25, 30 years ago, it was very, very rare. Antidepressants, the most famous being Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, these are handed out by not just psychiatrists, but by general practitioners like aspirin almost. And there's skyrocketing rates of depression in the United States in the last 50 years. So if you do take a look at epidemiological studies, epidemiological surveys, you'll find that there's a 10-fold, maybe 20-fold increase in the rate of depression in the last 50 years. Well, why is that? Well, some people who are critics of psychiatry, of which I am one, they say that it's just all about these people making much to do about nothing, that they're taking normal human sadness, normal human grief, that people are going through and labeling it as a disease and labeling it as depression. That certainly is the case. We have actual studies that show that happens all the time, that people who are going through just normal human loss, kick off these depressive symptoms, which are, which they have, low energy, inability to experience pleasure, lack of sex drive, these typical classics depression symptoms, because they're going through a normal human grief period. So that's one reason why you have these skyrocketing rates of depression, medicalizing, diseasing of normal human processes. But I think there are other reasons why you have these skyrocketing depression rates that have to do with our culture as well. So, for example, we know, and this is common sense, but lots of research shows that social isolation, lack of support, lack of community is highly associated with depression. Real scientists will ask the question, well, does depression cause social isolation, or does social isolation cause depression? Well, the answer is both. They both, there's a kind of vicious interactional cycle. But what we also know in our society is that, remember, depression rates are going through the roof. We also know that, besides that social isolation is related and associated with depression, we know that there's a dramatic increase of social isolation in America. So, last U.S. Census showed that we now have far more people living alone than there were 10 years, 20 years before, almost 25% of the population living alone. But even more significant than that, okay, because maybe some of these people who are alone have friends and they're not socially isolated. More significant than that was a study that came out a few years ago, which got a lot of attention, was that it talked about the number of confidants people had in their life, the number of people who they really trusted. And what we know now in America is that as of 2004, 25% of Americans say they have no confidants at all in their life, compared to 1985 when only 10% of people said there was nobody in their life that they could talk about the serious, most important things that are going on for them. So lots of reasons why we have this kind of social isolation and why people have been decimated in terms of community. But part of it is when you have a society that only is controlled by corporations, that only cares about bottom line, most money for shareholders, you don't care about human needs. You do things all the time that break up community, that break up society. People lose their jobs, they lose their entire industry, they have to move constantly. So lots of different things are going on. You build highways so that people are constantly in their cars and suburbia versus keep letting people live in small towns in the country and the cities where they could be closer with one another. So there's all different forces out there that create more social isolation. Social isolation is highly associated with depression. Depression rates are going through the roof. Now, that's not the only reason why we've got increasing rates of depression, but that's one major one. We have increasingly in our society childhood, so-called childhood disorders, which you never would have saw. It would be very, very rare, almost, you'd almost never see 25, 30 years ago any kind of kid, any child taking any kind of psychiatric medication. Now this is common, right? I mean, I talk to kids all the time, and they tell me the statistics that they hear, 10% or so of them are on psychiatric medications, totally wrong. They laugh. And most of the kids that I talk to, they tell me 25 to 30% of the kids in their schools are taking some kind of a ADD medication, Ritalin or Adderall or Addies as they call them, or they're taking some kind of a antidepressant, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft medication, or increasingly, more of them are taking antipsychotic chasers, with these drugs. They're taking these drugs called Risperdal and Zyprexa, which were really the replacements for these heavyweight tranquilizer drugs, Haldol and Thorazine, that went off patent, and the pharmaceutical companies created these so-called atypical antipsychotics, which are really not that much different than the old-fashioned ones, and they are creating enormous amounts of side effects. Many reasons why you have obese kids out there. More and more of American children are obese. Lots of reasons for that. But one of the least talked about ones is that so many of them are on these antidepressants, on these antipsychotics, which make it more likely that they're going to be obese. So all of these kids are being diagnosed with depression, with bipolar. The idea of any kind of kid being diagnosed with bipolar 25, 30 years ago was absurd. Kids were moody, right? Kids went up and down. Kids, would talk about feeling like suicidal one day and talking about like they're going to be, the president of the United States the next day. This was a kid kind of thing. But somewhere along the way, the psychiatry, pharmaceutical, industrial establishment, and make no mistake, they're proud partners. They don't hide this. There's a proud partnership between pharmaceutical companies and the American Psychiatric Association and the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They're proud partners with one another, that financially. And that between them, they decided that all kinds of kids were disorder, attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and a whole bunch of other kids were mentally ill, seriously mentally ill. And so now you have literally 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and given major heavyweight drugs, antipsychotic drugs. It's problematic enough that all these kids who weren't paying attention to boring schools were given speed, amphetamines, which is what Adderall is. Now they're given these heavy, sedating, zombifying antipsychotic drugs like Risperdal, like Zyprexa, like Seroquel. When you talk about diagnoses in psychiatry, there's almost zero reliability in any kind of diagnoses, because when you take a kid, I've seen many, many kids who've come in here diagnosed by some other doctor with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder. I've seen many, many kids, and I ask, well, how is this diagnosis made? And it turns out always that these diagnoses were made by these questionnaires that were handed out to parents to fill out or teachers to fill out. And routinely, I'll look at these questionnaires and I'll tell a kid before I even meet them, I'll say, I bet you I know which teacher that you really like. And of course, it's the one teacher that didn't diagnose the kid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what determines often, whether an adult perceives a kid with ADHD or any of these other diagnoses is, how much trouble that kid is giving them, how much they like or dislike that kid. They won't admit this, but I see this all the time. And so when you take a look at the reliability of paper and pencil subjective tests, it's going to be very low. Or you move towards depression. How is that diagnosed? If you take a look at these drug studies that assess people as being severely depressed and assess their remission rate, they're often used, the most common measurements that's used is something called the Hamilton Rating Scale for Depression. It's within the public domain. People can look it up on the internet. They can look at these questions themselves on this Hamilton Rating Scale. And what you'll discover is that there's an awful lot of questions there that have to do with your sleeping. So for example, you can earn 2 points for having difficulty going to sleep, 2 points for difficulty staying asleep, 2 points. You can earn up to 6 points for having difficulty sleeping, which is almost enough points to make you declare like you're in remission or out of remission. How many points do you get if you're like thinking seriously about killing yourself? Only a couple of points. You know, why is that? Well, these tests are loaded up so that it's more likely, you know, these drugs are going to affect things like your